whenever you're
All
ready.
right. Good morning, everyone. I see we've got two screens. There may be multiple people behind the screen, so this may include parents. It may include other family members and students. I'm Professor Gary Richards. I am the chair of the Department of English and Linguistics. I've been at Mary Washington for 13 years. My area of expertise is American literature. I do specialized studies in Southern literature. I also work with fiction and drama, and I do gender, race, and sexuality studies. So what I'm going to try to do today is give you a sense of what a college classroom might be like, explain to you how it's structured, and along the way, because of my topic, to maybe give you some takeaway information about humor works. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I hope all of you all can see that. Mr. Moore, everything looks good?
Looks great. It looks like another family's coming in, so welcome. Excited to have you here with us today. Looks good though, Dr. Richards.
Okay, what this class was a special topics class that I taught several years ago. It is a 300 level class. And at Mary Washington, the way our catalog for courses is organized, 100 level courses are beginning courses. Those are the ones that typically have no prerequisites. For those of you who will be here as new first year students in the fall, this will often be the type of classes that you take. 200 level classes are a little more advanced, but they're usually courses that are going to help you in your general education program. 300 level classes then are more advanced than that, and they're usually associated with your major. And then 400 level classes are the most in-depth. They're usually senior capstone experiences. So what I'm going to be presenting to you today with this presentation, Knock Knock, Neologisms and Naughty Words, the Structures of Jokes and Other Verbal Humor, is an example of a 300 level class. So it was given the number 375XX. American humor. Students jokingly told me that it should have been XXX because sometimes we got a little bit dirty. But what this course decided to do specifically was three things. The first thing, as you'll see there on the slide, is to give students an understanding of humor theory. And this is probably what will be different from your high school classes. Usually in high school classes, you are not given the theories behind what you're doing, the literary theories behind how you, say, read a novel or a poem. So we begin with theory, then in part two, we look at how various humor writers, such as Mark Twain, most famous American, probably humor writer, how they wrote their humor, what makes it funny. We analyze based upon that theory that we've learned, how the humor functions. And then the third part is for students to explore their own preoccupations with humor in US culture. So in part two, the folks that we look at might include the ones that you see on the screen. Do any of you all recognize any of those images? Anybody that you recognize? And you'll need to unmute if you want to speak because I can't see the chat while I'm in PowerPoint mode. Does anyone recognize any of these?
I do.
Yeah.
I see Dorothy Parker.
Yes, Dorothy Parker is on the upper right-hand side. And Maris, who was Dorothy Parker?
She was a poet. She was a short story writer. She wrote a lot of very witty, kind of sarcastic poems.
Absolutely. Both her poetry and her short stories tended to have very biting humor. She was probably one of the most famous writers in the Algonquin Round Table in the 1920s and 1930s. And this automatically raises one of the issues that we look at with humor. Is humor gendered? Humor has been dominated by men, but what we're seeing is more and more women taking on roles of humor. But is women's humor different? So the other woman that we have here on the far left, this is a woman who wrote under the pen name Fanny Fern in the 1850s and 60s. She was the first woman to be a professional newspaper columnist, and she wrote a humor column. So many students don't know about that antecedent to someone like Dorothy Parker. You have next to her at the top John Kennedy Toole, who wrote the comic novel A Confederacy of Dunces. You have below that Stephen Sondheim, who writes musicals, which are often very witty and humorous. And then in the lower right-hand side is Ishmael Reed, who wrote any number of postmodern comic novels. So we might read in the middle part of the class literary works by these folks. Then in the last third, this is when students get to think about who they find funny and what makes them funny. So I'm guessing many more of these faces are familiar to you. Who do you recognize in this slide?
Alec Baldwin,
Yeah, Alec Baldwin doing what?
Donald Trump
Yeah,
on
so
SNL.
Saturday Night Live doing those parodic skits. Anybody else that you recognize?
There's
Trevor
Noah.
Yeah, Trevor Noah doing his squat up there at the top. Anyone else you recognize?
There's also Maya Rudolph.
Yeah, I mean, if any of you all are fans of Big Mouth, she keeps me in stitches
I
doing
love that show.
doing the voices of the hormone monster.
She's the yeah. What, Corinne or Connie or something?
Exactly. And that's already dealing with bodies. We find bodies very funny. So this is just to give you an example. So there are other folks, so that students in the past have looked at memes, such as the one, the keep calm memes, etc. And then this variety of folks that you see up there. Because of time, I'm going to keep going. So we're going to focus today for the rest of the time on that first part of the class, where we look at the actual theorist. And the two theorists we look at is one that is very historical, Freud, there in front of you, and then a more contemporary one. So we begin by actually reading sections of Freud's 1905 book, Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious. Again, this is what's probably different from high school. Even if you talked about theory, you probably didn't read the theory in the original. So we read a translation from the German of the Freud. And so we quickly survey kind of the terms he gives, and then we start to see his argument. He's very defensive in 1905. He is having to explain to audiences that jokes really are worth looking at. And so he begins his argument by saying, we love jokes. We have any number of categories that we organize jokes into. Some of them are troubling, some of them are not. So here are some of the ones that he gives. He says that we love identity jokes. Now, identity jokes are often very nasty and aggressive. So you will see those types that are there listed. These will often include problematic language. And what it does is usually separate the teller from the person whose identity is under attack. So I grew up in Texas, so there are lots of Aggie jokes. People who go to Texas A&M, and they're usually about how dumb Aggies are. Dumb blonde jokes function the same way. A subset of that is famous people jokes. So I've listed some of those there. So a Helen Keller joke, for instance, is an identity joke usually about disability. They focus on Keller's deafness and her blindness. Michael Jackson jokes often focus on his asserted proclivities to have sex with young boys. Rock Hudson to be associated with AIDS jokes. So again, these are often very aggressive, tendentious jokes. But then there are more benign jokes, like knock-knock jokes. If I say knock-knock, how do you respond?
Who's there?
Who's there?
Okay, notice that everyone responded eventually. This is just ingrained in you. And you can think of 100 knock-knock jokes, most of which are bad. So knock-knock, who's there? Interrupting cow and a moo. You know, we've all heard those. Riddles and puns are usually pretty benign ones. Freud talks about shaggy dog jokes. These are jokes that go on and never go anywhere. So they're usually not very funny. And then we have gross out jokes. Gross out jokes are pushing our boundaries. We tend to find bodies very funny, but gross out jokes push us to the limits. So if we have time, I'll give you some gross out jokes at the end. My very first time of teaching this class, I was going over gross out jokes. I said, does anybody have one? And a student raised his hand and I thought, okay, I'm gonna risk this. And he told a joke that was so gross, it freaked me out in class. I didn't know how to handle it. So maybe if we have time at the end, I'll tell you that joke, if you can handle it. Okay, then we go on to what Freud says after he's defended himself. We need to talk about jokes. He begins to say that there are three elements to a joke. There's the form, that's the way it's written or told, the content, what it includes, and then the context, where it's told. And what he says is that it's really the form, not the content, that makes it funny. So that's why we can often laugh at jokes that are deeply troubling. If there is a tendentious joke, we may find the content very troubling, but the form of it can make us laugh nevertheless. So he begins to think about, well, what kinds of formalistic aspects do we laugh at? And he says that composite structure is one of those. That's when we take two words that have some overlap in the way they're written and combine them. So look at the second bullet there. You might have an uncle who celebrates alcoholidays. What that would mean is that he might drink too much. So it's the composite of alcohol and holidays that HOL is combined. So some examples are metrosexual. Most metrosexuals would not wear mandals, man sandals, so you've got that A in there. During the Obama administration, for people who did not support the president, they might refer to no-Obama. And then here in Fredericksburg, sometimes Mary Wash students will refer to the people on the outside as Frednecks. So Fredericksburg rednecks, you have that RAD overlap. Anna, I'm seeing you smile at that one. Why did you laugh at or smile at that one?
I just thought it was funny personally.
Okay, are you from Fredericksburg or the area?
No, I'm from Richmond.
Okay, but it tends to, again, kind of create a separation. We are the sophisticated one, they're the Frednecks. Okay, now sometimes Freud says this doesn't have direct overlap, we just shove words together. So your grandfather may be sporting a pair of moobs. It's where you just take man and boobs and run them together. Froyo is one of those shortened words for frozen yogurt. We have a preoccupation with body functions. So you might, if you're in class, embarrass yourself if you chart. If you go out drinking too much, you might sham it. And if you find a joke particularly funny, you might actually figgle. So you fart and giggle at the same time. Freud also says that we find it funny when there's slight modification. That is, there's a phrase that we know, but there's just a little bit of a change, a substitution. So Dorothy Parker, who we talked about earlier, in a review of Katharine Hepburn's acting, Parker said that her emotions ran the gamut from A to B. Well, to find that funny, you have to know that usually the phrase is to run the gamut from A to Z, so a long stretch. Parker substitutes B for Z, but what makes it funny is A and B are close together and B and Z rhyme. So Freud says the closer the sound of what's being replaced, the funnier it is. During the civil rights movement, James Baldwin, the African-American writer who happened to be gay, was sometimes derogatorily referred to as Martin Luther Queen. So this is a slight modification. It's riffing off of the civil rights leader Martin Luther King, but Queen replacing King, and a derogatory gesture to his gayness. Okay. And then, of course, all parodic porn titles. Any porn titles that take a dominant movie and change it. So, as anyone in high school who's ever read A Tale of Two Cities, you know there's the joke, A Sale of Two Titties. For many students who grew up with Harry Potter, they are horrified to find out there is a porn movie called Harry Twatter and the Sorcerer's Bone. Now, think about how this is like modification. You've got the pun there between Harry, H-A-I-R-Y, and H-A-R-R-Y. So it's almost the same, it sounds the same, but you've got twatter, which is a very British word, replacing Potter, and then bone and stone. So it is a very close replication. I've given you a couple of other examples there. Any of you all encounter some of these parodic titles? I'll let
Probably
you
every guy here.
What did you say, Ryan?
I think he said every
Oh, I
guy
thought
here
you
is
said
encountered
Flynn.
that.
Yeah, Flynn, not Ryan.
Sorry, Flynn. Yeah, I mean, so that we know these, it is often a type of gendered humor. Okay, let's keep going. Freud then moves to puns, and he says puns are the least sophisticated. Usually when we hear puns, we often groan at them. So what's black and white and red all over? A newspaper, a zebra with a suntan. But these then can get a little bit edgier. What's black and white and red all over? A penguin in a blender. So that it can be a little bit edgier. What time do you go to the dentist? 2:30. Notice these can't be written because it is the way we hear the words. And then an example of puns is often drag queens' names. So I've just listed a couple of those down there: Rachel Tension, Frida Slaves, Safonda Cox, Hell of a Bottom Carter, and Eileen Dover. So to get these jokes, you have to know, for instance, the actor Helena Bonham Carter to understand that. Okay, so puns are typically not very aggressive, but the drag queen names can be a little more so. Freud also talks about words with double meanings. Usually they have a public PG-rated meaning, and then they've got a sexual meaning. So you can look at the pictures on the slide and make those jokes there. These are in French double entendres. So think back to the slide two ago, shaving Ryan's privates. Privates is one of those words that's double entendre. The same thing with bone. And then, as you all know, you probably encountered this throughout high school. This is almost all "that's what she said" jokes. You use one of these sexual puns, and then someone says, "Oh, that's what she says." Okay. Freud then begins to think about jokes getting more complicated, and he refers to displacement. Displacement is where you think a joke is going in one direction and then it turns. So Freud was Jewish. He, in his book, draws on a lot of Jewish humor. So in translation, he gave this joke. Two Jews met in the neighborhood of a bathhouse. "Have you taken a bath?" asked one of them. "What?" asked the other in return. "Is there one missing?" So the joke there is about taking a bath. We assume it means to physically wash yourself, but then the second person thinks that it's one that has been stolen. So I'll give you an example of one. Again, if you don't see the answer, what's brown and rhymes with Snoop? What do you begin to think about? What do you think that joke's answer is?
Poop.
Poop, exactly. We're looking for poop, and instead we get Dr. Dre. And suddenly it is a displacement because, yeah, he is a person with brown skin, and he rhymes physically with Snoop Dogg. Okay. The next, can any of y'all think of other displacement jokes? I've got one that I'll share with you. Are you okay with a Michael Jackson joke?
That's fine.
I don't mind.
Okay. You okay, everyone?
Yeah.
Anna? Okay, so what is the difference between Neil Armstrong and Michael Jackson? Neil Armstrong walked on the moon and Michael Jackson had sex with little boys. How is that a displacement joke? How does it function? Flynn, you want to, or let's see, Blaze, you look like you're about to speak.
I was going to say, because we expect you to say that Michael Jackson moonwalked, but
Exactly. We think about Neil Armstrong walking on the moon, and we know that Jackson is famous for that dance move, but then the displacement is when it turns. So that's a displacement joke. Do any of y'all have displacement jokes you can think of? I'll let you consider that, and maybe at the end of the session, we can check back in. Okay, so the next one that Freud says is unification. We find it funny when things that aren't alike are put side by side. So this is why we laugh, for instance, if a tall, skinny person is standing beside a short, fat person. They don't look like they belong together. So we just find that funny. So verbally, the same thing happens. The example he gives that's not very funny is someone might announce that he's about to begin eating with a fork and much to do. Stephen Sondheim, in one of his musicals, has a character say, "I acquired some position plus a tiny Titian," the painting. So usually one of these is a concept and one of them is something physical. So for instance, if I look at Flynn and I say, "Ugh, you smell of BO and failed dreams," that's really mean, but it's also unifying two different things. BO is something quite literal. If we're standing next to him, we're getting a whiff of his pits. On the other hand, failed dreams is something much more abstract. So that's unification. One of the things that unification often does that makes it funnier is just string lots of phrases on top of one another. So my grandmother grew up in Texas. She had all these Southern sayings, and if she thought somebody didn't look very good, say a woman, she would say, "Ooh, she looked like 30 cents worth of dog meat with the 3 rubbed out." It just goes on and on. He looked like the little boy that was shot at and missed and shit at and hit. You've got that also verbal play. So shot and shit being very similar, it's that slight modification. An example, a final example might be if I look at Blaze after his first semester and he's done really well. And I say, "I wish I had your GPA and you had a feather up your ass," and then we'd both be tickled. It goes on and on. That's what Freud says makes it funny. It's not funny to say, "Blaze, I really admire your high GPA." That's not funny, but that phrase is. Okay. We also have Freud then saying more complexly is allusion. That's when there is a well-known phrase that gets revised. So I've given you a couple of examples there. I'm going to focus on Dorothy Parker's second one, the third bullet. She famously said, "You can lead a horticulture, but you can't make her think." How is this an illusion? What do you have to understand to find this funny?
You have to know that the like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. But then it's also a pun on the word horticulture.
Exactly. So it's an allusion to the phrase, "You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink." Then you've got that very sophisticated pun. And what Freud says is usually puns are pretty dumb, but the more syllables you have in it, the more complicated it is. And Dorothy Parker, horticulture, a 4-syllable pun. That's pretty sophisticated. You've also got that near duplication with slight modification. It's drink and think. So she has that rhyme there. That's a sign of a really smart humorist. Okay. So Freud then says, after he's looked at all of these forms, is that jokes can be organized into innocent ones and tendentious ones. Innocent jokes are like riddles or knock-knocks, and we hear them and we go, "Aw," or we smile. This is like when my nephew who is 6 tells a joke. They usually are innocent jokes. But he says, this is in the middle of that paragraph, "The pleasurable effect of innocent jokes is, as a rule, A moderate one, a clear sense of satisfaction, a slight smile, is as a rule all it can achieve in its hearers. A non-tendentious joke scarcely ever achieves a sudden burst of laughter, which makes tendentious jokes so irresistible. So what Freud says is we hear innocent jokes, but the ones that really make us laugh are tendentious jokes. They're the ones that are aggressive. They're the ones that might hurt people. So he says we have 4 different types of tendentious jokes. These are the ones that we remember: obscene jokes, hostile jokes, cynical jokes. And the difference, he says, between hostile and cynical: a hostile joke is when you single out a particular person or group of people that you're different from. A cynical joke is when a person who's part of that group tells that joke. So if I'm Jewish and I tell an anti-Jewish joke, I'm probably anti-Semitic. As if I'm not Jewish. If I am Jewish, it becomes a cynical joke. So those are the difference. And then he says there are skeptical jokes that are very rarely done. And it's kind of just a meditation on the absurdity of everything. Now, Freud concludes that, why do we tell jokes? What do they do for us? As you may know, Freud had an incredibly dark perspective on human nature. He thought humans were actually pretty sinister, disgruntled animals that were pretending to be civilized. And at any moment, we lose our civilization. Now, we can't do that. We have to remain civilized. So jokes are a way that allows us to do that. Rather than attacking someone physically, I might tell a joke about them. So that's why he says that jokes are actually useful. It allows us to express our anger, our hostility, things like that, without turning into aggressive animals. So the second humor theorist that we look at is a more contemporary one. He's a British humorist called Simon Critchley, and we look at his 2002 book on humor. And he takes a different approach. He looks at kind of big themes of what makes us laugh. One of the things he says that makes us laugh is animals. When animals act like humans, we find it charming. So think about stuffed animals. Almost every child has a stuffed animal. What does that stuffed animal look like? Or what does it act like in cartoons?
Warm,
In like a-
friendly.
Warm, friendly. Anyone else?
Like loving, caring, usually.
Exactly. Look at the Care Bear there, literally having the heart, and they sparkle. We go awe when we see animals that act like humans. Now, Critchley says, on the other hand, when humans act like animals, we can find it funny, but in a disturbing, disgusting way. So if you have read Kafka's The Metamorphosis, where Greg Samson wakes up one morning and he's turned into a giant insect, we might find that slightly amusing, but it also deeply disturbs us. What Critchley says is that reminds us of our own animalistic elements. The same thing in the novel Deliverance. You might have also heard of the film version of it, where one man is raping another man in the woods and demands squeal like a pig. So turning him into a farm animal during an act of violence is very, very disturbing to us, Critchley says. So that's the humor of the animal. The next thing he explores is the humor of the machine. Humans like to think of ourselves as being very different from machines. Machines are repetitive, unthinking, mechanical. So when humans begin to act like machines, we find it funny. When humans begin to act like machines, we find it funny. When humans begin to act like machines, we find it funny. Okay, what did you notice when I started repeating myself? How did you respond?
It was funny because you just kind of seemed like you were glitching then.
Exactly. Okay, so you begin to, it gets your attention suddenly. Has Richards gone off his rocker? What's going on there? And then if I had kept going, it would have been funny and then annoying and then funny again. So a famous example is the old I Love Lucy show where they're working in a candy factory and Lucy and Ethel are having to pick up pieces of candy and it's very repetitive. Then what Critchley says is we find it funny when humans act like machines, but we also find it funny when they stop acting like a machine, when they can't do it. So when someone is walking a certain way and then falls, that's an example of the machine failing. Okay. What Critchley ultimately decides is what we find funny is the distance between the way we like to think about ourselves and the way that we probably really are. So if you look on the left-hand column, these are the way that humans like to think about ourselves. We are cultured, we are soulful, we are metaphysical, we are reflective. He says even physical positioning can be funny or not funny. So standing up, he says, is not a funny position. In contrast, on the right-hand side, we are at the same time things. We're animals, we're abject bodies, we're machines. We are physical. And what do we know about our physical bodies? How our physical bodies betray us? What do they do that embarrasses us? How are we not in control of them? Yeah, Blaze.
Well, I mean, there's obviously like burps and farts and stuff sometimes.
Yeah. Some combination words, the start and the fickle. If you fickle in class, it's probably going to embarrass you. And how are other people going to respond if you fickle?
They're gonna laugh most of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. What we find funny in second grade, we still find funny according to Critchley when we're 5 years old. Because this is our body betraying us.
Hey, Dr. Richards, your audio is doing that thing.
I'm going to log out and log back in.
Yep. Sure.
Right back.
All righty. Sorry for that technical difficulty, everyone. Sometimes a little bit into larger sessions, Dr. Richards' audio gets a little wonky. So just wanted to make sure that that was fixed, but he'll log back in and we'll continue with the session in a second here. How is the session going? How's everyone enjoying it? Yeah, that is pretty ironic. I would have to agree.
I think it's really interesting.
Good, glad to hear that.
Yeah, same here.
How about now? How does it sound?
Perfect.
Okay,
Good.
I'm going to bring the screen back up. Thank you for, it says you disabled my screen.
Sure, here you go. I think since you left, I have to make you a co-host again. There you go.
Awesome.
There you go. Yeah, some of the students were saying it was ironic that your voice went robotic right after that.
And what did you all just do at that moment? You showed that you are learning from this very presentation. That is awesome. So
Yep.
I became the humor of the machine.
That's incredibly ironic.
Okay, I'm going to zip through these. We were all the way to the guy on the toilet. Okay, so we were talking about that right-hand column. Because Critchley is British, he actually sums this up in a pun. He says, we like to think about ourselves as our souls, but what really we find funny is our arseholes, that physicality of it. And so he says that, again, this even comes to physically positioning ourselves. It's funnier to be sitting down than standing up. Standing up, we have control. Sitting down, we lack control. So thinking about this unbridgeable gap, why do you find the image funny on the slide? Why do we laugh at this guy? Apply the theory that you just learned.
He's using like toilet paper, like it's a thing you can write on.
Exactly. Think about what writing is. Writing is one of the most metaphysical, abstract things we do. Language is where we create a symbol system because we can't carry around all the things we want to refer to. So it's incredibly associated with the left-hand side. On the other hand, the type of writing that he's doing is on paper that we associate with bodily functions. It's funny that he's writing on toilet paper. Okay. What else is funny about him?
He looks like you
Yeah, who's next?
can go ahead too.
I think the fact that he's on the toilet performing a bodily function makes it funny to us.
Exactly. Usually we don't associate that we keep our cerebral parts and our excretory activities separate. And yet in the age of cell phones, what do most of us do?
We're literally on it as we're going to the bathroom.
Exactly. I mean, so that is an incredibly, according to Critchley, an incredibly funny moment because we're sitting there and you might be having an abstract conversation with your grandmother while you're dropping the kids off at the pool. Anything else that is funny about this image? Think about illusion. Is this citing something famous?
The thinker statue, maybe?
Yeah. Rodin's very famous sculpture of the thinker, a man who is sitting thinking. He is not sitting on a toilet. Okay, so that's to some extent what Critchley would say makes this funny is that unbridgeable gap. As I say at the bottom, what makes us laugh, this is quoting from him, is the return of the physical into the metaphysical, or when the elements on the right column intrude upon those of the left. Now, Critchley is by no means the only theorist that's talked about this. You might have encountered this with the theorist Mikhail Bakhtin. He talks about the classical body versus the grotesque body. We find the latter of those funny. Nietzsche talks about the Apollonian versus the Dionysian. Freud is superego, which is kind of our intellectual civilized side, and id, which is our basic, pretty animalistic side. So I've given you two images on this screen. Which one is funnier?
Peter Griffin,
Yeah, why is Peter Griffin funny?
because he does a lot of dumb shit on Family Guy.
Okay, we know most of us are familiar with these two. So we've got Michelangelo's David, very famous Renaissance sculpture on the left, and Peter Griffin from Family Guy on the right. We probably know the way Peter sounds, the way Peter acts in that animated series. But just looking at the images, what makes Peter funnier than David?
Okay. He's bigger,
Yeah.
overweight.
Okay. We think about, according to Critchley, bodies that are out of control, bodies that are extremes, like that language. Freud says when we add more and more, we find it funny. David has been going to the gym. He's got his six-pack. He is very fit. He's standing in a very classical position. Peter Griffin, on the other hand, the most important features of him that are emphasized are that gut and that neck. Okay. What's important about those? What do we associate guts and necks with? What are they quite literally biologically associated with?
Eating.
Eating, exactly. Feeding the body. In contrast, notice how David's stomach is minimized. He is in control of it. What are the biggest things on the sculpture of David? Where are our eyes drawn?
I'll take a stab.
Go for it.
His six-pack.
It could be the six-pack, but those are relatively minimized. What's the most complicated sculpting? Where is it going on?
I feel like I know the answer.
Yeah, go for it.
The penis.
No, the penis is actually one of the smallest things on him. He's got one of those little delicate Renaissance penises. Even to the way that his pubic hair has been carefully groomed, it's been coiffed. He's been doing, to use a composite word, some manscaping. No, it is his hands. Look at those hands, how big they are. They're like baseball mitts. Why would Michelangelo want to emphasize David's two hands? What do hands signal?
I think maybe it could signify like lifting things up, being able to hold things.
Lifting things. It's also those things that allow us to be civilized. We write with our hands. We type with our hands. We text with our hands. If we're David, we use a sling to kill a giant with our hands. The other thing that is emphasized about him is his head. It's the cerebral. It is what he's thinking with. And notice his hair, how carefully sculpted it is, drawing attention to his brain. Now let's pivot. What do you notice about Peter Griffin's skull?
Just kind of blandish.
It's not just bland. Look at where his skull should be, where his brain should be.
His whole head just looks like an extension of his neck.
Exactly. He doesn't think. He is comic because he is not metaphysical, he is physical. And you're missing one final thing. Since somebody brought up David's genitals, where are Peter Griffin's genitals?
You can't really see them.
Nope, they're there.
They're on his chin.
Thank you. Peter Griffin
Oh my
has
God.
a set of testicles on his face. I mean, that he is, and notice that genitals are usually the things that embarrass us with our bodies. They are the things that seep and excrete and things like that. So David's are minimized. They literally, we're not to be focused on those. It's his face. For Peter Griffin, it's even on his face. Okay. So the final thing that we do in this section, the first section, is then I ask students to do exactly what you did when my audio went down. And that is apply what they've learned to a particular situation or a particular joke. So this student did a humor analysis of the Dr. Dre joke that we talked about. Okay, so that would be kind of what a college class in English might be structured around, and the way that we might go about talking about it. Notice that because this is a college classroom, the discourse is going to be different from high school. You might be talking about mature topics. You might be encountering language that you would never be allowed to use or hear, one would hope, in a college classroom. So I'm going to pause there and give you a chance to ask questions either about kind of what college experience the English classroom would be like, or particular concepts or things like that about jokes. And then if we have some time at the end, we'll tell some jokes. So I'm going to open it up for anyone who would like to ask a question or make a comment.
So this is more about like the lesson itself, the joke lesson.
Yeah, that's great, Blaze.
So you mentioned that like extremely like grotesque or bigger bodies and that kind of stuff is funny to people. What about like the opposite, where it's like the extreme fitness or the extreme like brain power? Because that can sometimes be funny as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what you've identified is anything that's taken to extremes. I would draw upon Critchley here and say that a body that is, I'm thinking about athletes that are so toned and so fit, they almost look like robots. They almost look like machines. If you've seen track runners, for instance, the way they move, it's like, we even joke about them, they run like well-oiled machines. That's where I can see the fit, physically in shape body actually having a bit of humor about it.
Okay, thank
Let's see, someone in the chat asked, is note-taking done on laptops, paper, or student's choice? It's absolutely student's choice. My policy is for cell phones and laptops, they are welcome in the classroom as long as they're being used to take notes, or sometimes we're discussing things in class and a question comes up and I'll just say, somebody Google that, or do a quick Wikipedia search. I mean, if we're using it to build information in the classroom, that's great. What technology shouldn't be doing is you texting with your friends or browsing the internet or things like that. But for note taking, students get to make their own choices. I do encourage them to take notes. We do know that it's useful as far as retaining things. And you may even, like in a lecture today, want to remember the exact joke. You want, as Floyd would say, you want to get the form down right, because if you don't get the form right, it's not a funny joke anymore. Okay. Other questions?
I got one.
Yeah, was that you, Marius?
You can call me Jeff.
Hey, Jeff.
Yeah, so my question is I'm kind of curious if you could tell me more about the English department at Mary Washington.
Our department it holds two disciplines, English and linguistics. Many of you all probably haven't encountered linguistics in high school, but if English is kind of the focus on the artistic and persuasive side of the English language, linguistics is a focus on the historical, the social, and the technical side of the language. So you might study in a linguistics class why we order words in the way we do, why we put nouns before verbs typically. You might explore, do women speak differently from men? Are there racial components? If you take history of the English language, how have we evolved from Old English to Middle English to our current English? How does slang function? How has language shifted with texting, for instance? All of that might be under the heading of linguistics. As far as our English classes, we tend to have kind of three main areas. We've got literature classes, we've got composition classes, and then we've got creative writing classes. We have two majors. One is the standard major in English, and it focuses on literature. And then one is with a concentration on creative writing. And that's where you still study literature, but you're also writing your own. We have three genres that we focus on. We focus on fiction, poetry, and nonfiction. So that's what we offer classes in. As far as the literature classes, we have options that literally go around the world. We have British literature, we have US literature, and then we look at literatures written in English from around the world. So Professor Banachea does hemispheric studies. He might be looking at both North and South American written expressions. Professor Dasgupta does Southeast Asian literature such as in India, that's often written in English. So those are the types of literature classes that we have. How can I clarify? What other questions do you have about the department?
I was wondering if you could go in a little more depth about the creative writing.
Sure. For creative writing, the way that it works, it's usually for students who want to go on to do a Master's of Fine Arts in creative writing, or if they want to go into editing, going into a profession where they are editing and publishing creative works. So we have a sequence in the creative writing program. All English majors, regardless of which of the two they take, you take a class that is an introduction to theory. Everyone takes that. Then if you're doing creative writing, you take Introduction to Creative Writing. Then you move on to junior level genre classes, and you have to have two of these. So you choose two out of those three options. Then you do a senior seminar in the genre you want to focus on. So you could concentrate, do your senior seminar in fiction, nonfiction, or poetry. And then the fifth class that we have specifically embedded within the creative writing major is one called the Literary Journal. We have our own online literary magazine called the Rappahannock Review, and students in that class edit it. So if you're a creative writing major as a senior, you will actually have concrete experience editing, of taking in submissions, vetting them, deciding what needs to be published and what shouldn't, rejecting people politely. How do you develop those skills? And then the nuts and bolts of editing an online journal. what we feel is so good about that is that sends you out into the world or to graduate school with concrete skills. And we find that's what employers are looking for.
Mhm.
Did that help?
Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Cool. Okay. Let me see if I can pull up chat and see. I'll go back. In response to Blaze, I think it's very interesting how we joke about extremes of fitness or brain power a lot of times. It is, absolutely. And that's what Freud says, is that much humor is dehumanizing. It, as Critchley would say, it reduces people down to their animalistic elements. So think about the sexist dumb blonde jokes. Dumb blonde jokes are almost always directed towards women. And what that does is erase their complexity. They're reduced down to nothing but their bodies, okay? Let's see, is there one English class that all freshmen take, or is there more options? It's the latter of those two. The way Mary Washington deals with writing is we have a system called writing across the curriculum. So by the time you graduate, you have to have 4 classes that carry the writing intensive designation. Now, these can be English classes. We no longer have a regularly offered freshman composition class, but we have a sophomore class called English 202, and it's writing about blank. And every one of these has a different topic. So it might be writing about sports. It might be writing about medicine. It might be writing about the South. And what this allows students to do is, rather than take a generic composition class, choose the one that might benefit them most. So a student doing a minor in sports management might take the writing about sports class. Someone who's pre-med might take writing about medicine. Now, you can also take writing intensive classes in your major. So you might be, say, a sociology major. There are going to be writing intensive classes in that major because each of these disciplines is a little bit different. Scientists write differently than social scientists who write differently from creative writers. So this allows you to do writing that is specific to the field you want to go in. Let's see, how do you pitch a joke writing class to the unit? How did I? Well, fortunately, we in the English department have a good deal of freedom with these special topics courses. We have courses that are regular parts of the catalog, and these are offered in a set rotation. But then we have, if we want to develop a new class, we are allowed to do it. So pretty much I was allowed to do this class, and then I look at feedback. I've offered it 3 times to see how students respond to it. They responded very positively to it, but I became chair of the department, so I don't teach as much, okay? Someone writes, what made you want to create a joke writing class? It's not a joke writing class, it's more of a literature class that looks at humor. As I say, my focus is American literature. I love reading funny literature. So I wanted students to explore, why do we find stuff funny? So that's what led me to do it. Do AP credit transfer in for AP Lang and AP Lit, and how can that help? Yes. AP, IB, even transfer credits that you may have taken as dual enrollment, those are assessed by our Office of the Registrar, and usually if you get a 3 or higher, it comes in with credit. The way that can benefit you, for instance, if you get credit for English composition, that can count as one of your writing intensive classes. So what that does is it frees you up to take more classes that you want rather than to take the classes that you have to have. As far as the general education program. Say if you take AP history and you get a certain score, you might get credit for a history class, and that history class could count in your gen eds. What is the best joke a student ever told you? Okay, I may use this as kind of the end. I apologize for the people whose questions came in earlier. If you do want to reach out to me, my email, it's both listed on the website, but I'm G-R-I-C-H-A-R-D, so my last name but no S on it, at umw.edu. I'm happy to answer on an individual basis questions that I didn't get to today. So this was a joke that was told to me by a student in this class. I'll tell it and then we'll try to analyze it together. Okay. Thank you very much, Blaze. That looks great. Two whales go into a restaurant. They are seated at a table and their waiter comes up to them. And he says, "Ah, hello, I am Henri. I will be your waiter tonight. Would you gentlemen like something to drink?" And the first whale says, and the second whale says, "Oh, just ignore him, he's drunk." How does that joke function? Did you find it funny? And if you did, what made you laugh?
The fact that the whale was those sounds he was making, the fact that it was actually him being drunk.
Okay, so it is in some ways a displacement joke that we expect when one whale begins to keen like a whale would, the second one is going to do the same thing. So we think he's going to be that, but he says, no, no, the other one's just drunk. What about Critchley and animals?
The one that's speaking in English is like acting like a human because you're not expecting a whale to speak in understandable human language.
Exactly. I mean, we have the expectation if two whales go into a restaurant, they are going to be that cute, charming, and then we get an animalistic sound. So we think, oh, these are real whales in a restaurant. And then it changes. What about excess? What about the way I sounded? Somebody says that's a pretty good whale impression. How long did that impression go on?
A little too long.
A little too long. Usually the way this goes is people laugh when they realize it's a whale impression. Then they're like, oh, how long is this going on? And then they laugh again because is he ever going to stop? I mean, so there are multiple components to the joke. What you all just proved is even within a 45-minute session, when you're given some theory, in this case about humor theory, you are able to analyze why we laugh at things, why we find them funny, and how that can function in culture. Thank you all for attending this morning. If you want to reach out to me individually, please do so. I'm going to turn it now over to Mr. Moore for a quick announcement.
Thanks all so much for joining, and thank you, Dr. Richards. That was fantastic. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your day for today's session. I put in the chat box there just as a reminder, if anyone is interested in heading over to our next sessions, the administration panels and Q&A. The link is the same link you started with today, but I put it in the chat box there if you all wanted to copy and paste that real quick. But again, thanks all for joining us for this session today. And as Dr. Richards said, feel free to drop any questions to him or myself. My email is amore7@umw.edu. So look forward to hopefully seeing you all in the fall on campus. And at this point, I'll close out the session. Thanks again.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you. You guys have a great day.
You too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So much. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Great.